America has a history that is not spoken of much. This is the Old Red Museum in Dallas, Texas. Until 1966, this building was the Dallas County Courthouse. It is now a historic government building, and it's on the National Register of Historic Places. It is also the spot where, over 100 years ago in 1910, a group of men threw a rope around the neck of an elderly black man accused of sexual assault and tossed the rope out the window where a mob strung him up to an archway. This is the spot where that lynching began. And despite the fact that thousands of these murders took place across the South, it is one of the only spots in the entire country where a lynching that took place is actually marked or even acknowledged. By contrast, there are numerous Civil War memorials across the South, ones honoring the other parts of America's complex racial history. A new report from the Equal Justice Initiative found that between 1877 and 1950, there were nearly 4,000 black victims of racial terror lynchings in 12 southern states. This map illustrates just how pervasive that lynching was, with those orange dots representing premeditated murders carried out by groups of at least 3 people. The report is part of a larger project by the Equal Justice Initiative to erect historical markers and memorials in these lynching spots, a plan meant to help the country reckon with its ugly past, and a plan already met with local resistance. Joining me now is the Executive Director of the Equal Justice Initiative and author of Just Mercy, A Story of Justice and Redemption, Bryan Stevenson. Bryan, thank you so much for joining me. This is such a hugely important project and such a hugely difficult project. The number 4,000 is not, I think, a number any American can fully wrap their head around in terms of the pervasiveness, the scope of these lynchings. And yet this seems to be one of the only full accountings of how we terrorized a certain group of people in this country. How have you learned the ways in which we have reconciled or not reconciled with our bloody past through this project?
Well, no, I think you're absolutely right. We have not spent a lot of time really trying to understand this part of our history, I think in part because it is so difficult and it is so disturbing. But it is essential that we understand this legacy of terror lynchings. We've spent an enormous amount of time first reviewing the accumulated data at Tuskegee University and by a couple of researchers, Professor Stuart Tolney and Woody Beck. And then we went into these communities. We've worked in this area for a very long time. We went to historical archives, into museums, into local newspapers, and found additional evidence that allowed us to document several hundred more of these lynchings. And what I try to emphasize is that it's not just the 4,000 people who were murdered, it's all of the African Americans who lived in these states that were threatened and menaced and terrorized by these acts of often tolerated and supported violence.
Yeah, that's one of the most devastating, I mean, aside from the horrific brutality, the fact that these lynchings took place in public, that children often watch them. I'll read an account of one, and I will just say in advance, it is very, very graphic. In 1904, in Doddsville, Mississippi, both victims, a husband and wife, were tied to a tree and forced to hold out their hands while members of the mob methodically chopped off their fingers and distributed them as souvenirs. Next, their ears were cut off. Members of the mob used a large corkscrew to bore holes into the victims' bodies and pull out large chunks of quivering flesh, it's hard to read this, after which both victims were thrown onto a raging fire and burned. I mean, you talk about having people acknowledge this, putting up markers to say this is where this happened. I can imagine how difficult it is for people to acknowledge that this is a part of our history. And I guess I wonder in your conversations, how do you underscore the importance of that?
Well, I do think it's hard, but I also think it's necessary. I mean, because not only did that grotesque violence take place, but it took place in front of hundreds and sometimes thousands of people who were celebrating that barbarity, who were eating popcorn and cheering, and that is that community. And so I do think we have to talk about what that represents, because the truth is that these lynchings created a narrative of racial difference. It reinforced a presumption of dangerousness and guilt that is assigned to people of color. It terrorized people until they fled. And yet, we mark and monumentalize events going on at the same time that were really behind that. We celebrate the Confederacy. We talk about the good old days of the first part of the 20th century. And I think because we are interested in talking about that era, we have to talk about all aspects of that era. It is true that these incidents were violent and disruptive, But that's part of what we've got to make some peace with, we've got to deal with, and we haven't done that very effectively in this country, and I think our ability to achieve racial justice and improve race relations has been compromised by our failure to do so.
Failure and I would say resistance to acknowledge that this terror, I mean, these were people who were, you know, a black man who knocked on a white woman's door and was lynched for that. I mean, terror is the word to use here, and I think it's really important that we emphasize that these were acts of terror.
Absolutely. I meet many people of color who are offended when they hear newscasters talking on TV about how we're dealing with terrorism for the first time in our nation's history after 9/11. And they say to me, Mr. Stevenson, we grew up with terrorism. We grew up with violence. The geography of African Americans in this country was shaped by the menace created by these terror acts. And you're right that they weren't just for people being accused of serious crimes. They were for social transactions. In Blakely, Georgia, World War I black veteran comes back and he's wearing his uniform and he's lynched because he refuses to take off his American Army uniform. A man in Laverne, Alabama, 1940, doesn't call a police officer with the title Mr. and is lynched for that offense. Running to a train station in Mississippi, a black man is lynched because he bumps into a white woman. And this kind of violence in response to these very minor social transgressions absolutely traumatized people of color.